to the first voter education program for the League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson. I am Judy Wood, the current president. And we are going to start off with an initial presentation from Shirley Sandlitz about a very important matter.
Good morning, everyone. I added to the materials you have on your chair just to give you some information on the judicial merit system, which is a system that Arizona has that is recognized as a good system by many in the United States. This is their most recent flyer. The league was very important in getting this to become an initiative law, and also very important to get the JPR, the Judicial Performance Review Commission, added to it in 1994. There are people here who circulated petitions to get those initiatives on the ballot, and they did pass. So I want everyone to be sure that you can see this and you can reference it if you want to know how judges get appointed to the court. There are 5 commissions that appoint judges to Supreme, Appellate, and Superior Courts in Maricopa, Pima, and Pinal. But really, the reason I'm here is I also gave you a colorful flyer because I have leftover paper from the state board on JPR, the Judicial Performance Review Commission, and I urge you to think about applying to be on that commission. The league has always had 2 or 3 or 4 members on this commission. I was on it for 5 years, a number of years back. We have 2 members on it now. We have Caleb Lingle in Maricopa County, and we have Norm Perry in Yavapai County and Prescott. Yavapai isn't under this. They're not under the merit system yet, but they probably will be after the next census, because the county has to have 250,000 population to go under merit judges instead of electing their judges. Okay, the reason to give you this is that there are more public people on JPR than there are judges and lawyers. It is structured that way. They can have no more than 34 on the commission. I think I put in here 30. I think they may have 32 right now. But I gave you a breakdown on this as how many come from different counties. And every now and then I get a call from one of the staff people at the court saying, do you have any people that want to apply for this commission, JPR? They are the ones who put on the ballot, retain or do not retain judges. In less than 30 days you're going to get, if you're getting a mailed early ballot, you're going to get it in less than 30 days, and the last pages are going to be judges. The judges will say retain. Well, I looked them up. They're all retained that are on the ballot, going to be on the ballot, because I checked them with the commission this morning. But it's a long process. If you apply to be on the commission and you're appointed, it's a 4-year position. Sometimes people have to leave, something happens, and so you might get an appointment of someone in between time. When I look at the commissioners from Pima County, there are 3 publics, and I was a public. Public is anyone that's not a lawyer or a judge. So it is an interesting commission to be on. If you are on it, you have to attend. They set the schedule so everybody is there, because you do review all of the judges from what is analysis that we hire a company to do and obtain. So if you want to have more questions answered, I'll be in the back afterwards and I can answer questions. I'd like to see more people apply. They will hold the application for a year in case there's an opening. And they also, if any of you are in Pinal County, they have also called me a couple of times and asked if I know anyone in Pinal County that would be a public person, because they pretty much consider that league members are fair, judicious people, and that we don't have an axe to grind. And pretty much when you have any kind of a low rating in the evaluations, it's from a judge in family court where there have been divorces. So we call them, the commission calls them in and talks to them to try to find out why they might get a low rating. The rating is quite complicated. It's many categories. So anyway, if you have questions, you can ask me later. I'm supposed to be clear.
Thanks, Shirley. That's really an important opportunity for us as league members to participate in our government, and that's what we're all about. Again, it is so good to see so many of you, and welcome to the beginning of this new year. So I want to turn it over to Joan Calsis, who will introduce the panel. We're so glad you're here, and we look forward to this marvelous program. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. I'm Joan Calsis. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters of Greater Tucson. I've lived here about 4 years, and prior to that I was in Illinois, where I moderated a bunch of stuff. So, good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
This is the League of Women Voters' attempt to continue opportunities for us to learn how to be an informed voter in what's called the post-truth era. The League of Women Voters was born out of the struggle of the women's suffrage movement in the U.S., a struggle that the world still bears in so many countries, with the intense pain of women being denied voting rights. In this country, women fought for the voice of over half of the population, the women, to be heard through the ballot box. But those early women knew that to achieve the vote was only half the battle. There was also that awesome responsibility of being an informed voter. And that essential piece of democracy has been woven into everything the League works for. Not only to get the vote out, but to have the vote reflect an informed voter. So almost 100 years since that 1920 19th Amendment to the Constitution, we are still determined to be and provide for an informed electorate. So this morning, whether you're a League member or not, we gather to continue to exercise that balance of power that every voter carries, to vote and to search for the truth. A truth we must ponder and come to know in order to take seriously that life-giving right to vote. We've all heard the passage, "The truth shall make you free." I would ask then, what does untruth make us? What effects does post-truth have on us? And too often in both the public and the private places in which we live, we can be confused and unwilling to vote because we either don't know the truth or we don't believe anymore that it exists. We're afraid of untruth, a truth twisted by greed or money or ignorance or power or ideology. And so too often voters abandon their right and responsibility, caught up in that sense of powerlessness and chaos. We struggle, and so we gather. And how do we begin this journey? How do we come to have reliable and available tools for checking news and campaign materials? How do we separate falsehoods from truth, understand a free press, and determine credibility? Who do we become, and how do we behave when it comes to the political and voting arena? How have we gotten into this quagmire in which so many despair and opt out? So, put on your hiking boots or your walking shoes. Stay open to what you feel in here this morning. We're on a quest to discover not only where and how truth can be found, but also what systemic obstacles lay in the path trying to thwart our journey. Fortunately, we have 4 people here who will both challenge and companion us on that journey. Our first speaker is Kate Kenski. She's an associate professor at the University of Illinois in the field of communications. She spent years as a senior analyst at the Annenberg Center at the University of Pennsylvania. She's the author of several books, Capturing Campaign Dynamics and the Obama Victory, and How Media, Money, and Message Shaped the 2008 election. Kate is going to help us better understand disinformation techniques and tactics, from campaigns that focus on climate to those directed at undermining the credibility of the news media. And then how our human nature gets caught up in all those places. So, Kate, a university mini class here. We are lifelong learners, by the way. So, Kate, you're on.
Thank you so much. When I was in graduate school, my area of focus was information acquisition in politics. And so I studied how it was that people learned political facts and then how those political facts ended up influencing their decision. Now, perhaps not surprisingly, even then, it was the case, years ago, that if you had to pick one variable that would predict how people vote and what influences people's vote, it's going to be their party identification. But at least at that point in time, there was room for factual knowledge about candidates influencing how people understood what was going on and potentially changing how they in fact voted. We now live in a different era, and you can even see this in the scholarly literature, where over the past 15 years, there have been fewer studies in some ways of political knowledge or political learning, and more studies focused on things related to tone and just general favorability about candidates. And I think that's very much in line with our contemporary situation, in which we've become less interested in what political facts are, or we assume that it's our side that has the facts and the other side that has the misleading statements. Now, when we think about the political realm, or when we think about, we should say, political discussion, we can think about things in terms of facts and things in terms of opinions. Sometimes it's important to recognize that the distinction between how we perceive things isn't particularly clear. So, as I have up here, our fact, are these things that we can prove true. One thing that I think has changed is how we determine truth, and our criteria for truth is now strongly influenced by our tribal political situations. And then, of course, opinion being how we express ourselves. It's important to recognize that those opinions are often based in part on facts and are often based in part on our emotions, and sometimes it's hard for us to distinguish between the two. Sometimes we hear statements and we think it's fact because someone we like said the statement. And we sometimes don't question things that we need to question. What I'll argue in this presentation is we particularly don't question our own side, which is in part why we are in our contemporary contentious situation. I wanted to, in terms of thinking about facts, bring you back to January 2017. And as you can see here, you may recall that that then White House Press Secretary Sean Spicer said, in regards to the Trump inauguration, that it was, quote, the largest audience to ever witness an inauguration. The New York Times and other organizations countered this by presenting picture shots side by side of the inauguration. And you can see that there's a difference here. Now, mind you, there are many reasons why it might be that one inauguration doesn't have quite as many people as another. It could be temperature, it could be weather, all sorts of situations, so we'll put that out there. But the important point here is that a statement was made that didn't seem to have the empirical support. And although we sometimes should question the visuals we see, because most of us, was anyone actually at the inauguration? Yeah, I wasn't either. So we are basing our judgments based on pictures, but it seems that when you look at the pictures side by side, no one's really questioning too much the authenticity of this here, although some different explanations for the brown spots were offered. So that led to a conversation on Meet the Press on January 22nd, when Kellyanne Conway made the statement that sometimes we have this difference in alternative facts. And I think this was really, a good foreshadowing moment, really of the era that we now find ourselves in, because facts can become debatable. at a stronger level than I think that they were before. I think that before there certainly was, differences, but usually the differences took place in terms of parties presenting different sets of information to support their policies, not necessarily undermining in the same way the basic premises of, was this crowd here or was it not here? That should be one of those kinds of statements, that there should be some kind of, the truth is out there, there is a truth, that should be able to be quantified and determined. In this statement on Meet the Press with Conway, there is something that is overlooked in the discussion, and I think it's also important. Before she made the statement, alternative facts, she made the argument that the press had really undermined some things in regards to the start of Trump's beginning of his presidency by floating a story that said that the Trump administration had taken down a bust of Martin Luther King in the White House. What she said on this particular program was that over 3,000. I don't know if she was saying, because we do sometimes say, oh, that's happened thousands of times, right? I'm sure everyone said that at some point, and you haven't really literally counted. So I don't know if her 3,000 statement was actually a quantifiable statement, which maybe she found, or not, but the point was that the media had reported a story that ended up being demonstrated to be factually incorrect. And it's kind of like watching kids programs where if you watch like a kid's cartoon is usually based on some kind of narrative where it's dramatic, kids are really mean to each other, and then in the last 2 minutes of the program they resolve things by being kind. The problem, of course, is that when you only have 2 minutes of being kind and you have 58 minutes of people not being very nice, what do you think the message is that kids take away? Right. Shouldn't be rocket science. And so this is essentially her argument. Her argument is a factually incorrect statement was made, it was made repeatedly, and then the correction ended up being, kind of a small, very quiet violin. Right? And so I do want to present this side as there were a couple things that were really important out of this Meet the Press interview. One certainly is alternative facts, but also I think what we have to recognize is acknowledgement that we tend to be very loud about things that we want to believe, and when things are demonstrated to be incorrect, we tend to get very quiet. All right. So, some things about misleading information that I think we need to think about here. One is that factual statements, as I say here, can be used to create misleading, inferences. That's the first thing, which makes sense. Also, though, we can have facts be what they are, but we can have things taken out of context. And I think this is something that both parties do quite well. And our hatred of the other side is so great that we only see the piece. It's kind of like, let me use another kid's example, on a playground. If two kids are fighting, who gets caught? The kid who started it or the kid who, defends himself? It's always number two. So I keep telling my kids, don't engage, right? Because it's always, because people don't see the full context of what led up to a situation. And this very much happens in our political realm, where we focus on the small points and we don't consider the broader picture, particularly when that broader picture may not necessarily be a history that is favorable to the portrayal of our side. And so here I want everyone to put on their radar that things can be, factually true, but the fact that we focus on might not be the most important thing that we actually take into consideration. And then finally on here is just when we think about misleading things. Sometimes, and this is really hard because we have different political philosophies, sometimes differences really don't come down necessarily to the facts, but how we prioritize them, because we do have different values. Some of those that are simply not going to be, rectified through an easy discussion. I think abortion's a clear issue, right? I think that we can probably narrow down the facts, maybe agree on certain facts, but very simply, we can't necessarily make someone who's pro-life, pro-choice, or pro-choice, pro-life through conversation, because there are fundamental value differences, and we tend to not want to recognize that the other person might not be evil, but they may have a different set of value priorities. In that, and thinking about context, I want you to think about the news and how news presents information. Here I have an example. If you've been following the story in Texas, a situation in which Mr. Gene, as you can see here, a black man was shot in his household by a white police officer who claims, we're still sorting out the information, claims that she accidentally went into the wrong apartment. She thought it was her apartment, and it was his apartment. He was one floor up. The claim is that the door was ajar, something happens. All right, so that's the story that we're currently sorting with. And one of the tweets coming out of one of the Fox station was, as you see here. So the tweet says, developing, search warrant, marijuana found involving Gene's apartment after deadly shooting. All right, so let's go back to what I said about context. This is emphasizing something that, let's just assume for the moment, could be factually true, that he could have marijuana in his apartment. Is that the most important part of the story? No. So my take is no, it is not the most important in the story, and we can talk about search warrant, anyway.
A bunch of people to click on it.
And that's just it. And so now we have people who have a different understanding of the situation, who accept a different set of information, make a different set of judgments because of this. All right, next, I just want us to think a little bit about misinformation versus disinformation. So there are situations in which people make statements and the statements end up not being true. This is essentially the difference between lies and untruths. Untruth is not actually some kind of euphemism. I mean, something being false does not necessarily mean it's false for intentionally bad purposes. Now the problem is that when someone from our side says something that ends up being untrue or false, our assumption is they made a mistake, it's misinformation. The other side's assumption is that the person is intentionally trying to mislead and deceive. This becomes hard when it comes to actually trying to do studies on disinformation, because it requires us to have some insight into the motivations, and unfortunately most of the times we can't really touch people's real motivations. We can make inferences about them. And so the point here is does deception happen? Yes. My argument would be, though, that we tend to be particularly unkind or uncharitable or unempathetic when the other side makes a genuine mistake, and we tend to pounce on it and rip it apart, because for us it's more important that our side wins than having a civil discussion, letting them correct their mistake and moving on. That said, we also tend to discount the disinformation that happens from our tribe, that is used to try to persuade those in the middle that the other side is problematic, is evil, and is going to lead to the destruction of the United States. This is a chart up here that I think is useful. It was created by Claire Wardle, who studies the news. And what she did was she categorized different types of problems that we might see in information. So as you can see here, sometimes when people make problematic claims, it could be that the problematic claims is some kind of false connection. So this happens when headlines or visuals don't actually support the content. And so I think of this one as like clickbait, right? You see some kind of story, it sounds like it's really going to be interesting, you click on it, and it turns out that it's a bunch of useless slides giving you the most prolonged backstory to maybe a final slide that really just maybe repeats the headline. There's, of course, false context, and we've talked about that. There's manipulated content, which certainly happens. It's hard with the manipulated content because sometimes the manipulated content could be a serious manipulation intended to deceive. Sometimes the manipulation happens as essentially what becomes like the source of parody. And that's harder because this is where we say, oh, you didn't get the joke, right? And that's an easy, when you get caught, oh, I was just kidding. There is actual satire and parody. There's misleading content, imposter content, and fabricated content. There, of course, is also a series of reasons for using the content. And as you see here, sometimes we have the misleading content that's created because it's just bad journalism, it's sloppy. Sometimes it's parody. Sometimes it's to provoke, either provocateur or to punk. Other times it's passion, partisanship, profit, which is going to be part of the problem in trying to correct disinformation, political influence and power, and of course propaganda. Wardle then took the types of content and matched it against the different types of reasons, as you see here. And I think that when we're thinking about disinformation in particular, we really are essentially thinking about propaganda. Now, to understand why this is so popular, we have to consider both structural and human limitations. So at the individual level, why is disinformation? Why is it that when something is deceptive, we are so likely to believe it, not to correct it, not to do something like go to factcheck.org or Snopes to see if it's true? And the first things that affect our human decision making is one, what I've sort of alluded to already, which is that when information is primed, our mind tends to focus on that information that is given to us repeatedly. So if we are consuming content that says the Trump administration removed a bust of Martin Luther King, and we've seen that 3,000 times. And then another source says, well, actually that's not true, and we know it's not true. In our minds, that heavy weight of the repeated information is going to affect our judgment even when a correction is taking place. This becomes particularly problematic because usually the problematic information is a lot more interesting and evocative than the correction. And second, in our decision making, is something called reactance. This is an unfortunate human condition that occurs in us all. This is a situation in which when we either are on the fence but like leaning one way, and someone from the other side comes and tries to make an argument, even if it's factually based, our instinct frequently will be to dig in our heels and actually go further in our already held position than before. So in studies, for example, when it comes to vaccinations, when you try to do a vaccination campaign and people have questions about vaccines or already know that they're not inclined to get them for their kids, and you present fairly non-evocative statements about risks, the data show that those people who are already leaning not to get the vaccinations are even more inclined not to get the vaccinations. It's been applied in other domains. I would say in the literature, health is where they've studied it the most, but it appears in politics as well. And the point is sometimes, and I think particularly in this heightened tribal environment, when you present facts and you make an argument, and I don't know, you bring the 50-page report that demonstrates what you're trying to show. The problem is that we have a psychological, I would argue, deficiency in that our instincts, our guts, are going to be to dig our heels in rather than keep open minds. Other things that we tend to do that are problematic. Cognitive dissonance. I'm just going to go through these quickly because I know that we want to hear from the other speakers as well. But so our tendency is going to be, but basically.
Shoot my time. You can keep going because this is all good.
Well, thank you.
You can't go forever.
Cognitive dissonance. Basically, this essentially means that when we have, let's say, a narrative in our head, and we get that piece of information that challenges what our mind already says is true or is the way the world works, we become incredibly uncomfortable. Essentially, we don't like things to make us feel like hypocrites or silly for having chosen something. You've probably heard of, like studies on like buying cars. You can buy a lemon, right? Invest your money. It can be proven that your car is a lemon, but you still love the car. That's because it's uncomfortable to realize that we may in fact be wrong. In-group, out-group. Unfortunately, this is a human tendency that we tend to defend our in-group and we tend to be less charitable towards the out-group. The only time when this really seems strongly reversed is when someone in our in-group breaks our norms so egregiously that we basically want to call them out. But it has to be very egregious. For example, in crime studies, if you're white, your in-group is other white people. And let's say someone who's black would be considered out-group. When they show people news stories of the perpetrator being white with a white accomplice, that's breaking a norm because we don't like our group members to be making us look bad. So we tend to penalize when we come with punishments that type of pairing more harshly. But if the white perpetrator, because again this is in-group, is paired with an accomplice who is a minority, then we like to blame the minority. That is, our tendency is to only really challenge our in-group if what they've done is fairly egregious and we can't punt what they've done to someone who's part of the out-group. We tend to be attracted to negative information. You probably know this. You know, the negative headlines tend to be, again, more evocative. We tend to like that. And importantly here, we tend to be incredibly bad judges of our own limitations. This is in the realm of what we call bias blind spot. This happens in all sorts of conditions, not just politics, and we all do it. I study it and I do it. I try to create, I've helped create programs where we figured out how to minimize this cognitive bias. That doesn't mean you're never bias free, even through education and training. Studies show that some of the people who are most egregious in being bad assessors of their own information are the educated, because the educated make the assumption that they already know everything, and so they're less willing to actually challenge what it is that they know, or what they think they know. All right, then of course there's media structures themselves that act as part of the problem. Here, it's just the basic fact that if you look at the way media are set up, and so I have an example here from Moonves from CBS, basically saying, when Trump was doing all sorts of stuff, this is good news. And by good news, he meant it's making a profit for CBS. That's a complication, right? Because if the way we come to understand our political world is through news structures, but those news structures, they're set up for profit reasons to focus on the conflict, not to focus on when groups get along, when they're making progress on something. That's a problem. And of course this goes to our own biases because we're attracted to negative information. We feed into this. I also have the example here from Mark Zuckerberg. Now, Facebook is trying to engage social scientists to figure out better ways for Facebook to corral problematic content. But the bottom line is there are free speech arguments for disinformation. Should someone be allowed to give bad information? And from a free speech perspective, yes, but also from a profit-driven perspective, yes. And so there isn't a whole lot of incentive on social media, although there are claims to try to track down disinformation and to boot, for example, Alex Jones, who's information wars. But anyway, that's a complication. So in thinking about disinformation, I just want to end by saying that if we are going to combat misleading information and disinformation, we have some major problems. At the individual level, we are bad judges. We don't want to take what it takes to challenge the people within our own parties to do the right thing, for us to vote on candidates who aren't spewing the misleading information. And at a more macro level, the media system doesn't have a whole lot of incentive to go against their profits when it comes to also capitalizing on this type of information. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Great class. Dylan, are you a shorter lecturer?
I can be.
Okay, good. Dylan, that's great. Dylan is our next speaker, Dylan Smith. Dylan's the editor and publisher of the Tucson Sentinel. He chairs and I have to read this, the local independent online news publishers association with more than 100 sites across the country. He comes from a long, long line of publishers and journalists. Dylan's journalistic presence has seen the decline and the fracturing of public truth in the media landscape. Far from being an enemy of the people, however, he sees himself as informing and enlightening his readers. My dedication to truth-seeking is in my DNA, he says. Dylan Smith, could you please take us into that fast-changing world of yours?
Well, I must admit that on my Facebook profile it does say that I'm an enemy of the people. So if you check me out on Facebook, you will see that I freely admit that. I'm much more interested in having a conversation with you guys and what questions you might have. And so I don't have a huge, long spiel to go through. I just want to a little bit set the stage about the state of media, especially local media, because I think we get caught up a little bit too much in talking about Donald Trump and national things and how that affects our perceptions. And certainly there are a lot of issues there, but a lot of that is really grounded in the stuff that's happening here. I'm troubled by the idea that's expressed in the title of our event today about post-truth elections. The very idea that we can talk about being in an age of post-truth, frankly, troubles me. I still believe that there are facts, that the truth exists, that there are things that we can collectively establish as verifiable. Of course, that idea is under attack, and that's why we're talking about that today. From Trump on down, people are really trying to get rid of the idea that we can, across whatever partisan divides, across whatever disagreements we might have on issues, that we can get down to some certain kernels of facts. And that's a big problem in our social discourse today, that people, as the example you brought up about the inauguration, and the ridiculous discussion that ensued from that little comment. And if you look at what Sean Spicer actually said, he was factually correct. part of what is going on is a purposeful trolling, a baiting of the press, and people who will react against certain statements. What Sean Spicer said was that that was the largest inauguration ever witnessed by people in person, and I don't know if you can't remember if he said online or virtually or something like that. So yeah, maybe it is. Maybe enough people watch that streaming and on TV all over the world. But what you were supposed to take away from that was that nugget that there were more people there than ever before. And certainly that wasn't true. It was a purposeful kicking against the idea that the press will say this one thing and you're supposed to believe something else. And those are those alternative facts that Kellyanne Conway was talking about. And that doesn't just happen at that level. That happens at the state level. That happens here at the local level with some politicians who want you to think that those of us who are reporters are lying to you. And sorry, we're not lying to you. You might really disagree with something that we're telling you on a certain day, but we're not just making it up out of thin air. I mean, that's just really too much work, and the truth is a little bit too interesting. There's way too much out there to report on for us to take our time to conjure things up. One of the things I wanted to get into was, and you brought this up a little bit, talking about the profit motive behind news, and there is just too much journalism out there that is breathless, that is clickbait, that really wants to make you react to a headline or an image or an idea, that doesn't want to inform you so much as have you react to it and share it, and so they can spread it around and try and get some more money out of it. And that's one of the most, I think, unfortunate repercussions of social media, is that things that are not so much true sometimes take on a life of their own. And that even happens a little bit in the press. The stories about the bust in the Oval Office, it was moved. It just ended up behind a doorway that was open. And the pool reporter that day, and that was the very first day, I think, of the Trump administration, there was the pool reporter in the Oval Office was taking down his notes, and he noticed that had been moved from the place where it was, and so he wrote that it was not on that specific table, because he was, just taking notes so that everybody else in the media could understand what was going on in there. That's the job of a pool reporter. So then a whole bunch of other reporters took that and took the next logical step without checking it out and reported that it was no longer in the Oval Office, and that wasn't true. And you could start thinking about, well, did they hide it behind the door just to purposefully try and bait someone into doing this? Or did they just decide to maneuver some things around in the Oval Office? But the problem is, that is the story that everybody ended up, one of the many stories everybody ended up reading over that weekend, was that was moved and it was gone, and not quite true. So that's sort of trying to make us in the press react a little bit, and then everyone else react, does not lend itself to being the most thoughtful approach to getting down to the facts, which are the things that we really, really need in order to come to some better decisions about where we go as a community, as a state, as a country. The other big issue that's going on in media today is that so much of it is controlled by national corporations, huge, quite often hedge fund controlled corporations that really aren't interested in investing in journalism. What they're interested in is what they can get out of it right now. They want their profits now, they want their stock price to get as high as possible, and it's about extracting as much value as they can. And virtually every source of news out there has been sucked into one of these conglomerates over the last several decades, and that's getting worse and worse and worse. The number of levers of control over the news that you read is shrinking, and I think that's unfortunate. There is a way to get back to more authentically local control of the news that we get at the local level. But even when you're looking at the national level, it's important that we don't have just a couple sources of information determining, essentially, for you, for me as I'm reading national news, what is true and what is false. We need to have more sources of information that they act as a check and balance on each other, and that's vital. And one thing I wanted to get into just a little bit is what you as individuals can do about this. One is support different sources of news. Give us your money, subscribe to the newspaper, subscribe to TucsonSentinel.com. Make sure that you're sharing those things around, that you're talking about them, that you are not just focusing in on the things that support your individual point of view. And most importantly, stop sharing memes on Facebook. There's not a single political meme out there that has a shred of factual value to it. They're all designed to either make you really happy about what it is or make you really mad about what it is. They're not designed to inform, they're designed to make you react. And that's not good. Take a second, think about it, maybe chuckle, but move on. And go find some real news and spread that around a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Chris Weber. Chris is an associate professor of government and public policy. He will examine the psychological and social science features of this post-truth era that involve, I think, Chris, and I hope I'm not off here, but tribal allegiance, critical thinking, low voter turnout, and emotions surrounding voting. Chris recently won a distinguished fellowship from the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy. And get this, is examining the effects of authoritarianism and its role in the 2020 election. Okay, Chris, you've piqued our interest. I think we're in for another mini class on these unfolding relevant issues of today. So Professor Weber, class begins.
Well, first, thanks for inviting me out. Again, I'm Chris Weber. I'm from the School of Government and Public Policy. Much of my work and teaching, I should say, focuses on political psychology, so the intersection between politics and psychology and how psychological characteristics inform things like news consumption and various political behaviors. I struggled a bit with what to present here, since there's really a lot of ground one could cover if we think about the various ways human psychology shapes news consumption, information consumption, and American politics. So ultimately what I opted to do was sort of review two characteristics which are actually quite serious problems in American politics. And they actually relate really quite closely to this handout you have, which shows partisan bias. And so what I want to do, instead of sort of looking at the effects of some of these characteristics, is sort of step back and say, well, how did we get here? How did we get to this environment in which some voters are on the lower right, some voters are on the lower left, and then other voters are in the center? And then ultimately, what does that mean in modern American politics? So what I'll do is I'll first start by reviewing two characteristics. So there's sort of a classroom setting to this. I'll review what's known as political polarization and how we define that in academia. And I'll also review its close relative, which is known as partisan ideological sorting. So let me first explain what they are. Political polarization is arguably one of the most serious problems to confront our current democracy. Simply put, it's the notion that our two political parties have grown ideologically separated over time. The Democratic Party has moved to the left, The Republican Party has moved to the right, and the distance between these two parties is larger now than in really many, or any time during the 20th century. So I'm really partial to graphics like this, which I think are hard to see because I can hardly see it. But on the left we have 1800, and it goes all the way through 2010, I think. I can't see it. So we see this over time trend. The little dots represent individual legislators. These are members of Congress in each legislative term. The color coding should make sense. The red is Republican, the blue is Democrat. The lines represent the average. So we can see the average degree of liberalism and conservatism. Higher scores mean more conservative, lower scores mean more liberal. What you can see is that the Democrats are consistently, as a party, more liberal than Republicans. Republicans are then more conservative. But what's important to note is that there's a lot of overlap prior to 1990. That is, there are many cases of Democrats who are conservative and Republicans who are liberal. That is, the parties overlap a considerable degree. So if we look here, you know, there's a lot of overlap. But what happens is that when we approach the present, there's very little overlap. The most liberal member of the Democratic Party, or the most liberal member of the Republican Party, is still far more conservative than the most conservative member of the Democratic Party. That is, there's very little common ground anymore. This has a number of important implications, as I'm sure you can imagine. One is ideological gridlock. It just simply put is difficult for members of Congress to come together and reach a consensus. The second thing I want to note is I know there's a lot going on here, but is this gray part. This is the average over time, and you see this ping-ponging back and forth. And that's also really important, because what that means is that in certain eras or in certain periods, the Congress, oh, I did move it. In some periods, the Congress is quite liberal, in other periods it's quite conservative. This is also important because what it means is that the majority party, the party in power, may in fact advance a legislative agenda that is just simply unpalatable to the minority party. And a third consequence, which I will focus much of the talk on, is what does this mean in the consequence of voting and voters? That is, all of us. And so polarization has a close relative, and it's known as ideological sorting. And sorting is just simply the process by which the parties have grown more kind of cohesive, more ideologically cohesive. Liberals have moved to the Democratic Party, and conservatives have moved to the Republican Party. And we don't really see much cross-fertilization anymore. And so what I present here is just the relationship between ideology, so how liberal or conservative voters are, and then their party identification. And the key thing to note is this really increases over time. So the measure here ranges from 0 to 1. If there's a score of 0, that means party identification has nothing to do with ideology. If I know a person's ideology, it says nothing about his or her party identification. A score of 1 means these two things are perfectly aligned. If I know your ideology, I can perfectly predict your party identification. What's really striking about this is in contemporary politics, the correlation or this relationship is 0.6. In other words, liberals have really sorted themselves into the Democratic Party. Conservatives have sorted themselves into the Republican Party, meaning that, again, we don't have much of this ideological overlap. So a natural reaction to this, especially when I present it to students, is, well, who cares? Why does it matter that the GOP is the party of conservatives and the Democratic Party is the party of more progressive policy? Well, the argument, or the reason that it's important is actually quite similar to some of the things that Dr. Kenski presented, which is first partisan prejudice. Americans are actually increasingly likely to denigrate those who hold different political values. So if we actually poll people and ask them questions like, well, how happy would you be if someone from the opposing party moved in next door? There's a non-trivial number of people who say they would be really upset. It also contributes to what are known as political echo or information echo chambers. So you have this graphic here, and you can see that you may know people like this. There are people who only consume certain types of information. They only watch Fox News. They only consume conservative media, or others who only consume liberal media. And so what's happened with all of these changes in information technology is that we can actually self-select into information environments in which our beliefs never are challenged. They go completely unchecked. We're never exposed, or we're rarely exposed to competing points of view. And so much of the work that I do actually focuses on the psychological foundation of these kind of trends, this notion of sorting and polarization, and then the consequences of these things, particularly when it comes to the type of news and information people consume. So rather than reviewing a whole slate of psychological characteristics, I can't because there's not enough time, I'm going to focus on one which I've actually been studying since graduate school, which is the notion of authoritarianism. And so just one disclaimer, we use the term authoritarianism all the time. I'm not referring to authoritarian regimes, nor am I referring to authoritarian leaders. Instead, I'm referring to authoritarianism among voters, which is just simply put the tendency to submit to authority and to favor a kind of hierarchy and not question or challenge authority. And what I want to do is just spend some time summarizing the consequences of authoritarianism in politics and how it relates to this idea of sorting and polarization. And I want to also make one disclaimer. Authoritarianism has a negative connotation. It's not the term I came up with. This characteristic actually dates back to before the Second World War. Rather than rather than reinventing the wheel, I'll use the term because that's what other people use. Simply put, when I use the term authoritarianism, I mean a preference for things like conformity or social conformity versus the inverse of that, which is a preference for individual autonomy or personal autonomy. And I'll just say that some of the stuff I'll present here is actually collaborative, so I don't want to claim all credit for this. This is actually work that's conducted with two other political psychologists, Chris Federico at the University of Minnesota, and then Stanley Feldman at Stony Brook University. All right, so what is authoritarianism and how do we measure it? Well, it turns out there's a lot of different measures that we could use. The one that I use in my work is entirely apolitical. It has nothing to do with politics. It just simply is a measure of desirable characteristics in children. So what we do, or what the surveys we do, or we rely on do, is they ask all participants in a survey the extent to which, or the values that they most value, or the things they most value in children. So you would be asked the question, when thinking about children, is it important to be obedient versus self-reliant? Is it important to be respectful of elders or independent? So this has nothing to do with politics. This is just simply a child-rearing scale. Again, this has a long history. We don't have time to talk about it here, but I'm happy to answer questions. And again, the main point here is that authoritarianism, as sort of I see it, is this preference for conformity versus autonomy. Okay, so that's the psychology part. What about the political part? We could ask, well, fine, this is a measure of child rearing. People will answer the question, but does it matter politically? It turns out that it's actually one of the strongest predictors of how people vote. So what you can see here, again, it's hard to see, but this is 1992, 2000, 2004, 2008, 2012, and 2016. This is authoritarianism. This is the probability of voting for the Republican candidate. And you can see that in all of these graphics, authoritarianism matters. Authoritarians are more likely to vote for the Republican candidate. Non-authoritarians, that is those who favor personal autonomy, are more likely to vote for the Democratic candidate. What's particularly striking is how this line becomes steeper and steeper over time. In fact, if we look at 2016, there's a massive divide between authoritarians and non-authoritarians. Authoritarians, that is those who prefer obedience and tradition, are in excess of 80% likely to vote for Donald Trump. Non-authoritarians are about 75% likely to vote for Hillary Clinton. So there's this massive division just based simply on this psychological characteristic. What's also pretty striking is how this relates to party identification. And so here I just have, again, it's a lot going on. The dark distribution represents non-authoritarians, the light distribution represents authoritarians, the dark distribution represents non-authoritarians. And the key thing is that over time, these distributions separate. That is, authoritarians are finding a home in the GOP, non-authoritarians are finding a home in the Democratic Party. During the Clinton era, that wasn't necessarily the case. There were quite a few authoritarians who still identified as Democrat. And so we see this massive separation with respect to authoritarianism and party identification, leading us to sort of suspect that one of the characteristics leading to this notion of sorting is actually this stable, individual difference, psychological characteristic known as authoritarianism. So how does this matter in terms of this panel, or why does it matter? Well, it turns out that authoritarianism is also strongly intertwined with people's media consumption habits. Authoritarians seek out information on this chart that is actually quite different from non-authoritarians, meaning that we're not likely to see much common ground here. So here is cable news, really just CNN and MSNBC. This is the expected number of times in a week that an individual reports watching CNN or MSNBC. Authoritarians really don't watch CNN or MSNBC very much. They do, however, watch Fox News quite a bit. And so what does that mean when we think about democratic politics and political discourse? These groups of voters are going to very different media or information environments to seek out information. And even when we look at things like network news, which is really at the top of your graphic here, the unbiased part, what we see again is the same pattern. It's not quite as stark, but non-authoritarians seek this out. Authoritarians are far less likely to seek out this kind of information. You may have noticed in these slides that this only pertain, the presentation, or the figures only pertain to non-Hispanic whites. And so you might ask, well, what is this construct, what does this thing do, or what effects does it have among minority voters? And so part of this story, especially when we talk about tribalism and identity politics in particular, is maybe authoritarianism is actually related to many of the group-related divides that we see. So it actually isn't the case that authoritarians are moving to the right. It's the case that white authoritarians are moving to the right. Minority groups, particularly African American authoritarians, are the most likely group to identify as Democrat. And so when we think about many of these sort of divisive aspects of American politics, especially related to groups, it seems that authoritarianism is actually really a key component in this argument. So, because I probably am out of time, I didn't time myself, but let me just kind of summarize here. Time? Okay, authoritarianism, again, is aligned with voting. It's an underlying cause of sorting, which relates to this, this notion of seeking out partisan echo chambers. It's contributed to identity politics in a number of ways. Non-Hispanic white authoritarians have gravitated to the GOP. They vote with the Republican Party in or they're much more likely to vote with the Republican Party. Non-authoritarians, on the other hand, have gravitated to the Democratic Party. They're much more likely to vote for the Democratic Party. And authoritarianism, we believe in this work contributes to the very divided sort of partisan allegiances we see in politics, which ultimately translate to the way we seek out information in this post-truth era. So that's, for the most part, all I have. I have other work that kind of speaks to some of this, how people consume information in this era, really related to things like emotions. So I can discuss emotions. Okay, so various emotions affect how people process information. Emotions such as enthusiasm and positive emotions and even anger tend to lead people to seek out biased information. They're more likely to seek out information that coincides with their beliefs rather than challenge their beliefs. Other emotions such as fear and anxiety tend to have a completely different effect. It leads to kind of an opening up, more likely to expose oneself to different points of view. So, you know, if you're a liberal, you may be more likely to seek out conservative information, or at the very least, consider conservative information. There are important consequences for these emotions with respect to political behavior. So anger tends to really be empowering. It tends to motivate people to participate. I mean, look at why people participate in rallies and protests. They don't do it because they're really enthusiastic and happy. You see a lot of anger in protests. But the important thing to note is that disconnect, and that anger may be leading to participation, but it's not leading to thoughtful, unbiased participation. It's motivated to sort of reinforce one's existing belief structure. And again, I'm happy to answer more questions about that.
Wow, thank you, Chris. Our fourth speaker is Jill Jordan Spitz. Jill's a Tucson native and a neighbor, okay, and has had a long career in journalism. She's been working for papers all across the country, but she is now the editor of Tucson's Arizona Daily Star. Her focus has always been on watchdog and investigative reporting. She's the recipient of numerous local and national honors in that field. She sees herself as a journalistic truth seeker. So Jill Jordan Spitz, thank you for being here. This time could you speak instead of write? And it's all yours. Thanks.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for being here today. I think this has been a really good conversation. And I'm going to try to sum it up, and then we'll get to your questions, which I think is really the most important part. So Kate talked about the differences between lies and untruths. And in my business, I think those have sort of amalgamated together in an alarming way into something called fake news, which is really two very different things, and a lot of people don't see it that way. So there is truly completely fictional stories that are put on, usually online, to trick you, to make you believe something that is patently not true. Then there are stories that are factually correct that don't meet your worldview. Those are not fake news. And I think that they have melded together. I guess there's one sort of side is a story that is factually correct and has an error. There are millions of stories that are put online by legitimate journalistic publications every day. There's going to be errors in them. We try to ferret out those errors. We try to correct them as quickly as possible. And in a consistent way, we don't want to hide that we're correcting something that is wrong. Also, not fake news. What I think is the really dangerous stuff is the fake stuff, and there's a lot of it out there. And there's a lot of it. I think people sometimes think that it's only national or international news that's fake. There's a lot of blogs out there that are highly partisan and have a lot of incorrect information. So I want to focus on some of that. A couple people have mentioned local control of media, so I want to just tell you really quickly about the Star. We're owned by a company based in Iowa. It's called Lee Enterprises. They own, I think it's 43 publications. Most of them are tiny. We are one of the big players. There's St. Louis and Madison. We're the only communities of any size within the company. And I've worked for this company. We were owned by Pulitzer and then bought by Lee in 2000, I think, so it's coming up on 20 years, and never has anyone from the company asked anyone at our publication to write or to not write a story, to change a story. People ask me all the time, what's the politics of Lee? Honest to God, I have no idea. I don't know. The people who run the company, what is their worldview? I don't know, because they've never foisted it upon us, which I'm delighted about. So what we do at the Star, we have a news staff of about 70 people. One thing I should say about Lee, it is publicly traded, and so we do have investors, and our budget has consistently fallen. So for the past 10, 15 years, we've lost a lot of people. At our peak, we had 160 in the newsroom, and now it's 70, so less than half of what we used to do. And that means fewer reporters out there finding stories. That means fewer editors who are catching errors, which is why you see more really silly errors, double words, missing words, stuff like that appearing. So it's not all rosy, but in terms of journalistic pressure from on high, none of that. So what our reporting staff does is we write stories about Tucson. We focus entirely on Tucson and Southern Arizona. We do run national and international news in our paper. We don't write that news, we purchase it from a wire service. The service we use is the Associated Press, which is the biggest wire service in the world. It's taking a lot of heat right now from conservatives who believe that it's biased. We actually have somebody, I don't believe that they are biased, but I have seen instances where there's some sort of loaded language that will, like a mostly positive story about the economy, and it'll have a throwaway line that I think really taints the story of, after a week of horrible headlines for Trump, then finally something good happened. I don't think stuff like that should be in there, and we actually have assigned somebody to look for stuff like that. So I think things like that consistently do contribute to a feeling that there is bias when really there is not. So we hear a lot, more than anything, I get more calls than anything about our stories about Trump, which, as I said, we don't write them, but they are in our paper, so we have to take ownership of them. I get those calls every day. I understand the frustration behind them, and as I tell people, and I tell all of you, we are looking for as much balance as is possible, and when there is positive news, especially on the economic side, we grab that and we run it and we try to put it on the front page. But you should know, it is extremely hard to find news that I think supporters of Trump would see as positive news in any legitimate journalistic publication out there. It is not there. That's especially true on our editorial page, and people seem to think that we are running only Trump haters and very liberal conservative, or very liberal columnists. In reality, we've added about 8 conservative columnists to our pages. They are not huge Trump fans. These are people who have been staunch supporters of Republican administrations and presidents for 50 years, many of them. And they are not big fans of what's happening right now. So unless you know who some of these people are, you might not even know that they are conservative. So we are doing our best, but there's not a heck of a lot to choose from right now. So people sometimes, again, the calls that I get, people say that we are trying to make Trump look bad, that we're looking for stories that make Trump look bad. We are not doing that, and we are trying our best to find stories that are balanced and that are fair. But what reporters are doing is covering what he says, and a lot of what he says tends to be fairly outrageous and I think fairly negative. And an awful lot of it is just demonstrably untrue, not even arguably untrue. There's a lot of publications that are keeping lists. The New York Times, I think, is over 3,000 now of demonstrable, not arguable, demonstrable untruths, and what they're starting to just flat out call lies. And journalists, we just don't have it in our DNA to let that kind of stuff slide. So when we see stuff like that, we just can't ignore it. That said, fact-checking is not new. You see a lot of it now. It's been going on for a long time. And I think it's wonderful. We run an Associated Press version every Sunday. There are sites, I think Kate mentioned factcheck.org. There's politifact.com, and probably Snopes.com is the oldest. That they do nothing but this kind of work. They take stuff that people say on all ends of the spectrum and in between, especially if a reader asks, is this true? And they will ferret out the truth. So again, a lot of Trump supporters seem to believe that this is a liberal sort of conspiracy. It's been going on a long time. Obama was fact-checked by fact-check.org every week. So on PolitiFact has a truth-telling meter. So their Trump-o-meter right now, 16% of Trump's statements have been found to be true or mostly true. So Obama had the same thing over his 8 years. 49% of his statements were found to be true or mostly true. So both of them, that's more than half. What they're saying has been found to be true or found to be mostly or largely untrue. So neither of them has a terrific record, but on Trump's side, 84% of his statements have been found to be largely or largely untrue. That is a lot. It is just a lot. So wanted to talk a little bit about spotting fake news, because as I said, it is pervasive. It's not all fake websites that are out there. This shows up on, not necessarily, I hope you never find something like that on our website or on a legitimate news publication, but it's hard to tell out there what's real and what's not. So I just wanted to share some tips that I thought were worth sharing. This is from, most of this stuff is from factcheck.org, which is really great. So the first slide, and if these don't work, let's not even worry about it, let's just not worry about it. Consider the source, and in this I mean in the big scheme of what is the site you're looking at. Look at the URL. Is it a .com? Is it a .org? A lot of them are these weird, one of them I'm going to mention later is .com.co. There's a lot of stuff that just looks weird. Almost all websites have an about page. If they don't, that's a big red flag. And if they do, if you're not sure what that site is, look at it. There's a site that is a fake site called WTOE5 News, which sounds like a real site. But if you read the about page, it says it's a fantasy news website. Whatever that means. Mission statements. A lot of publications will post their mission statement, which is another good thing to look at. And see if you can contact a real person. They usually will have a contact us either way at the top or way at the bottom. There's another fake news website called the Boston Tribune. Again, sounds like a real site. And their contact information is nothing but a Gmail address. There's no person that you can reach. There's a site called whatdoesitmean.com, which I see shared a lot. It posted a really popular story saying that the Obamas were moving to Dubai, which they're not. And its mission statement says that it is one of the top-ranked websites in the world for New World Order, conspiracy theories, and alternative news. So they put it out there, and they openly say this is not true, but come on and read it and share it with your friends anyway. Snopes.com keeps a list of fake news websites, and they update it all the time, so that's a great place to look from time to time. Another good tip is I get calls all the time, why don't you have this story about this insane thing that has just happened? Because it didn't happen. And a way that you can tell that is if there's only one publication that you've never heard of that is saying that this happened, and you do a Google search, nobody else has that story, it's probably not true. Occasionally it just hasn't, it hasn't bubbled up yet. Very occasionally is that going to happen, but it's very rare that only one publication is going to have a true news story. So look for some repeat customers out there. Someone else, I think Dylan mentioned this, but read beyond the headlines. So many people are sharing stuff they have not read. And you can tell they have not read it because the comment that they put about it, they do this on our stories, is not remotely what the story said. And they'll have something that's completely untrue and really misleading about a really legitimate piece of journalism. So read it before you share it, please. Check the author. Most legitimate publications, if you click on the author, it'll take you to a bio of the author, or it'll take you to other stories that author has written, so you can see if they are a legitimate journalist and what kind of work they're doing. One of these sites, it's abcnews.com.co, the one I mentioned earlier. Their primary reporter is a guy named Jimmy Rustling. His author page says that he's a doctor, and that he's won 4 Peabody Awards and a handful of Pulitzers. No, he has not. So that's a good place to look too. A lot of stories cite bogus officials or bogus websites, bogus reports. And they trick you by having a hot link. So it'll say, you know, this this information comes from this report, and there will be a hot link to it. And I think they just figure people aren't going to click on that, because if you do, you'll either find there's nothing there, or what is in that website is not at all it doesn't at all substantiate what the story is about. And sometimes there will just be fake organizations cited. So if it's something that you really care about and you're tempted to share it, just do a little digging into some of those. It's not hard. It's usually a hot link. Just click and see what you have. Boston Tribune, again, that fake news site, said that Obama's mother-in-law was going to get a lifetime pension, big fat pension for the rest of her life because she did childcare at the White House. Not true. So the story cited the Civil Service Retirement Act, which is real, and it had a link, but the link didn't say anything like that. Last year there was a really popular graphic that was being passed around that showed murder statistics by race, and Trump retweeted it, and he said that this comes from really reputable, what did he say, from sources that are very credible. And it cited FBI statistics that were just not true. They were just completely fake. And you can find those statistics, pretty much everything's online now. It's not hard to find. Another popular thing is passing off old news as new news. There was a headline relevant to a lot of us that the headline was Ford shifts truck production from Mexico to Ohio. So this was shared a lot by supporters of the president, saying that he has succeeded in taking truck production, Ford production, out of Mexico and shifting it back to the United States. But that story was from 2015. So, you know, if you click on it, the date's there, you see it, but again, people are just, you know, sharing that stuff. We talked a lot today about checking your biases, which is super hard, I understand. But one thing I see, if you see a story that sounds just so outrageously wonderful, and you want to believe that so desperately because it matches your worldview, that's really one to dig into before you believe that it's true. It's like the old, you know, if it's too good to be true, it probably is. And finally, I mentioned this earlier, but consult the experts, that factcheck.org, politifact.org, and snopes.com. I'm sorry, it's politifact.com. And snopes.org. They're really good. They have a lot of really good journalists checking stuff out every day, and you can send them stuff and ask them if is this true. And either they've already checked it out, you can find it on their website, they'll send you what they've found, or a lot of times that's how they decide what they want to look into, so they'll look that stuff up for you. So finally, why does this matter? Free press is critical to our democracy. We do not get everything right. We do make mistakes, but we will tell you how your money, the government's money, is being spent. We will find corruption when it exists and ferret it out. We will hold our public officials accountable for what they say and what they do. We all need that, and we need it now more than ever. Without a free press, bad things happen. The worst thing of all is politicians are no longer accountable to you. And with that, if we get to that point, then I can't imagine coming back from that. You should consider that dictators around the world have all picked up that fake news moniker, and they're using it like crazy, and they're using it to not be accountable, to take the people who are looking at what they do, they want those people to go away and to be silent, so nobody is looking at what they do. So with that in mind, I wanted to thank you all for being here today, for paying attention, for doing your part. It really matters to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jill. First question, Chris. What do you think independent voters fall in your sorting process or on your graphs? Where do we go with independent voters in all of your studies? Thanks.
Independent voters who are authoritarian tend to shift to the right more frequently. Independent voters who are non-authoritarian tend to move to the left, but there's a lot more slippage. They don't necessarily consistently vote Republican or Democrat. That was concise.
Okay, good. All right, I hope
There's
that
really no
answers.
such thing as an independent
That's
voter,
right.
is there? I mean,
There is a literature on whether independents truly exist.
the vast majority tend to vote with one party or another.
Yeah,
and they like to think of themselves as independent.
That's correct. So if you look at the distribution of independents, Republicans, and Democrats, independents are a large group of the population. But at the end of the day, they need to vote for someone. There are two choices from two parties, and most either lean to the left or lean to the right. So this notion of pure independence has actually been studied pretty extensively, and there isn't a lot of evidence that there are many of these voters.
Anyone else have anything to say about that? Please, panelists, do speak when you want to, okay? Jill, can the Star edit AP stories? Can you cut out inflammatory lines, or can you add local angles that exist?
Yes, yes, and yes, and we do all of that. We used to have a much bigger copy editing staff. They're the ones who choose and pull and edit those stories. They used to spend a lot more time on them than they do now, honestly, because there's like a third of them than there used to be. But like I said, we have recently put someone specifically on the Trump stories, and I know that that's a common question out there because our publisher just asked me that same question. He didn't know that either, so a lot of people don't know that, but yes, we can.
Okay, thank you. Anyone? Kate, given your research about emotions, bias, and reaction to information and facts, how is it best to share information in order to clarify truth or influence others?
That is an excellent question. What I would
We are the league. Most of us.
Actually, I really like Jill's comment about if it's too good, it's probably too good to be true. Just dig in a little bit before you do that. I would say one thing is if you want to influence others about a position, really look at the source. If you are liberal and you want to convince your conservative friends of something, I've already told you that that's probably not really likely. But one way you can really actually, I think, get the reactants to dig further down is to choose a really liberal source to offer that same piece of information. So if you want to overcome, you might want to consider, I want to convince someone of X, try to find other sources that are from that X domain to offer the information. Now that can be incredibly difficult when the sides are so polarized. But I think that's your best strategy if you want to convince someone and try to dampen down the emotion.
So if you're a left-wing Democrat and you're trying to convince your Republican friend that Trump was wrong about something, find that Fox News or Wall Street Journal story that says Trump was wrong.
Yeah, there's going to be greater source credibility, and so you at least get a sliver that not everyone on the right thinks this way.
Or conversely, if you want to prove Obama wrong about something, find Rachel Maddow calling him out.
Absolutely.
Okay. Question. Campaigns seem aimed only at motivating the base. Policy issues seem lost. What are voters to consider if policy positions and facts are not discussed? Anybody? This was directed to nobody in particular, but everybody. You're gonna have to think faster than this.
That is one of the big problems we face, is that we have so many candidates, and you can't really, I hate to be a, both sides do it kind of person, but literally both sides do it. We just had a Senate primary, a very important Senate primary in this state, and did I see a debate? I don't think I saw a debate. Did anybody see any of these candidates show up for a debate? Nope, none of them did. Because they don't want to be pinned down as far as, making definitive statements about their positions. And I think it's incumbent on all of us. It's our damn job to, keep pestering them about what it is they actually think and what they will do. But as part of this process of democracy, you guys need to be a little bit more vocal about not just holding the people you disagree with accountable, but hold the people that you think you might agree with accountable. Tell them they need to show up. Tell them they need to tell you what it is that they have planned to do. Otherwise, we end up with, amorphous politicians who we are hanging our preconceptions on, rather than people that we are interviewing for a job. That's what they're doing. You know? Elected officials are temporary contract labor. They work for us.
Anyone?
Yeah, I think it's important to separate the primary campaign from the general election campaign. The nature of campaign ads in primaries are just really quite different because they do appeal to a more ideologically extreme base. In the general election, I think you're even starting to see this even in Arizona races. There is a large portion of the public who are moderate, and you see candidates tempering their position to some degree. I think they have to. And I guess another point is that it's always been the case there's very little you can learn in a 30-second spot. And so part of the goal of campaign messages seem to be to motivate people to seek out further information and learn. Whether or not that actually happens is a different thing.
One thing we're seeing ever much more of, especially in the last election cycle and in this one, is campaign messaging that's designed to turn you off, to make you not want to go to the polls. It's not to so much boost up the base. Politicians pretty much assume that their base will show up, sometimes to their detriment, as we saw with Hillary Clinton, thinking that union voters would show up for her, and they didn't. Why didn't they show up? Because they got turned off at the entire prospect. And so much of, not just the Russian interference in the election, but so much of the campaign commercials we saw in that 2016 election were designed to make you so disgusted with the entire process that you would not show up. And we're seeing some of those sorts of ads running here, in the Senate election, in the congressional races. They want to make you check out, and I would imagine that most of you in this room are interested enough to not do that. But think about your friends and family and neighbors who are not completely invested in this process. And if they are, pushed away by all of the messages that are out there, they're not going to take part. But what would an ad like that look like? A good example this week would be the independent expenditure, the PAC ad that's running in the Senate race that has old clips of John McCain knocking Ann Kirkpatrick. It's not so much about a message that Kirkpatrick is a bad choice. It's more of just setting a tone of negativity in that race that's designed to make pretty much everybody not care so much. And then, the strategy there, and it's a pretty clear strategy, is that the right-wing Republican base will show up anyway.
I just wanted to add one thing on that, and that's, I think that we're in an era where collectively, as individuals within the collective, maybe we've all kind of become fragile snowflakes. And I think that because of polarization, we are not used to seeing challenges by the other side. And without those kinds of conversations, I think we become hypersensitive when we realize that the narrative within our own ideological position isn't necessarily as clean as we want it to be. And so the real consequences, our frustration, can lead us to back away.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks, Dylan, for picking that up. A question for Chris. Republicans seem to be more anti-government and less likely to support programs for the common good. How does this mesh with authoritarianism?
It doesn't. It's not. So there are divisions within the Republican Party, which I'm sure many of you have noticed, where the kind of the fiscal conservative, smaller government wing is now at odds with the more populist, authoritarian-led wing, which is in many ways enacting policy that Democrats tend to endorse. And so I think what you'll see over the years is this division, and restructuring and sort of recalibration of what is the party, what is the voice, and what is conservatism, and what is the status of modern conservatism, what does that mean? It's undergone revisions in American history. The more recent one was in the 1960s and 70s, sort of pairing the traditionalism element with the smaller government fiscal responsibility tradition, and I think we're in for another realignment.
Thanks. Anybody? Next question. What is the effect of poll results on the attitudes of elected officials at the national level? This is just for anyone. Jump in.
Poll results as in running opinion polls about a specific issue?
I would think so, the opinion polls.
If you are not in a swing district and you're not up for election and it's not a poll specifically about your constituents, I don't think you give a crap. I think you're the people who voted for you, the people who gave you money, and that is what you're concerned about. If you are a member of Congress from Southern Arizona or a member of Congress from Delaware or wherever, it doesn't matter what somebody in Montana thinks. It matters what your donor thinks. It matters what your voters think.
Anyone?
Yeah, I would also say another characteristic of politics now is that it's national, it's not local. So, local races are now focused on Trump and national politics. And what that means is that if there is attention to polling results, I think there is actually more attention among local candidates to national polls. I'm not sure that's necessarily a good thing. One of the scary things too, we talk about the news a lot, but is just the ease in which people can conduct polls now. And there is a real science to polling. People, get PhDs in this area, and what's kind of scary about this is that it's really easy to put together a poll, write really bad questions that are loaded and give you a certain result, and then have a candidate maybe run with it as good news.
Anyone else? Okay. Well, Chris, as long as you're talking to you, did I hear you correctly? Non-white authoritarians tend to align with Democrats more.
Yes. So one of the things that we observe is particularly among African Americans, the authoritarianism actually has the inverse effect. It leads to stronger identification with the Democratic Party. It's not quite as strong with Latinos, but it's sort of like halfway between African Americans and Hispanic whites. But it still is this relationship where authoritarianism is actually sort of pushing this group to the left, so to speak.
Anyone else? There was a phrase used, and I'm looking for the card that I wrote it down on. Echo something.
Echo chamber?
Echo chamber, is that it? Can you define that better?
So an echo chamber basically refers to our tendency to focus on media that tends to come from the same perspective. We can feel good because we're looking at three sources, but the three sources basically maybe have the same, sometimes parent company. And if not that, at least the same ideological perspective. But again, the idea of the echo is, you look at the Wall Street Journal and it matches something that you saw on Fox News. Or you read something in the New York Times and that was echoed on MSNBC. In your mind, you went to two sources, but those are the same kind of sources tending to draw from the same kind of people that go back, basically echo the same thing back and forth rather than inserting a different perspective.
And your social interactions will help reinforce that even further. The friends that you talk to, the conversations you have on Facebook, the people you run into at the grocery store and at church. And if you are always talking within the same milieu, you know that those messages will echo and sort of reinforce themselves as having perhaps more grounding in the facts than maybe they do. It might just be an interpretation, but in your mind, because you've heard it over and over again and seen it and heard it from different people, it's now a fact.
If you use social media like Facebook, there's an app that you can run. It's called Echo. And basically what it does is it goes through your friends list and does an assessment of where they seem out of Facebook to be getting their sources. And it runs it on a red to blue continuum. And you can get a sense of the shape of how purple are you or not.
And this is in some ways another form of sorting, in the sense that, again, we're surrounding ourselves with like-minded individuals, like-minded information that doesn't challenge our beliefs. And so that may be media, that may be acquaintances. In some cases, folks have shown that it's where we live. Like, ask yourself, are your neighbors of the same political leaning as yourself? And all of these things have kind of increased in recent years, and I think we need to ask ourselves, well, what is the consequence of that when we think about political discourse? I mean, how do we discuss politics if we never expose ourselves to competing points of view?
And the problem with doing that is sometimes it's just going to make you so damn mad. If you are a person who habitually watches Rachel Maddow and you flip over to Fox News for a few minutes, you're probably going to end up throwing the remote at the TV, right? You're not going to sort of rationally assess what they're saying and how they're saying it, and you're just going to be angry and reactive.
And another thing is, a foundation of American democracy is tolerance. And what does this mean when we think of tolerance and our ability to, tolerate things that we don't agree with if we never expose ourselves?
Yeah, if you don't know what it even exists.
Or what it is or what it means and so on.
Thank you. Jill, are stories about what may happen or reports about someone's opinion as an issue considered real news?
What was the first one?
Are stories about what may happen, or reports about someone's opinion?
Typically, I think no. We try not to do that. We don't write stories about someone who's going to file a lawsuit or somebody who says they're going to do something. So no, I would say that is something that we try to avoid, and I think most legitimate publications try to avoid. I'm sure there are exceptions. I'm not thinking of one at the moment, but in general, no.
Well, with broader issues, stories about the implications of our decisions now are important, like water issues. And Tony keeps writing a lot of great stories about what might happen with various decisions that we're making.
Yeah, but there's a set of facts and you're taking an action. I don't see that as, I think the question, the way I interpreted the question is more, in general, if more ethereal kinds of, if this happened then this, if this happened then this, I see those as different things.
Okay, next question. On the graph handout, you all have it somewhere there. I don't know who put this together, but what is the difference between original fact reporting and fact reporting? Anyone want to take a guess at that?
Well, original would be that you went and did the legwork and looked it up yourself. You are not just taking an already known set of facts and repeating them. Both are part of the exercise of reporting. We can't go and look up everything every time we write a story. I mean, we know who the mayor is. We don't need to go look up an original fact. Knowing where the mayor is today and understanding what he's doing, taking that extra step would be finding something original.
But based on this chart, I don't think that, I have no idea what is the difference when you look at these two, because for example, New York Times and Wall Street Journal are both in fact reporting, but not original fact reporting, and they both have incredibly skilled reporters who are digging deep into, security and exchange documents and political documents, and they are doing tons and tons of original reporting. So I can't answer that question. It doesn't seem to make a lot of sense.
Well, some of these, like what just jumped out, Daily Beast does a lot of really amazing investigative reporting, and they go check out a lot of original facts. They also regurgitate piles and piles and piles of stuff that's been published elsewhere. So that might be a good assessment. But yeah, when you get more towards the top of that chart, like the AP, the vast majority of what is on the AP wire is a story that they picked up and repurposed from somewhere else, from another news organization, from a member news organization. They do a ton of their own original work, but I don't know that they are the, top of the pyramid when it comes to reporting original facts, when 90% of what they're doing is not reporting original facts. They're just spreading around stuff that was originally reported elsewhere.
Okay, a couple questions left. One wants to know, Chris, if you've read a book. Whoever wrote that, could you come up and ask Chris afterwards? Last question, what is the influence of political comedy? Where did this come from? But it's an interesting question. The influence of political comedy. Okay, why don't you start off?
Yeah, sure. The background on political comedy really has different origins, whether you're looking at the liberal side or the conservative side. The conservative side considers more sort of a trajectory of hyperbole. So if you are liberal, you might not recognize some of the forms that conservative comedy takes. And on the liberal side, it tends to focus more on irony. And there's studies on this. And basically, what I would say is, regardless of the two, the problem is that we've conflated entertainment with news, and that has many problematic consequences because of that. But one of them is, for a long time, sort of like the king maybe of political comedy, would have been Jon Stewart with The Daily Show. And I think that there was a trajectory where people enjoyed a bit of the snark. And one consequence of it is when the other side picks it up and uses the same tone, depending on where you are ideologically, you no longer appreciate it. And I think that everyone is kind of claiming themselves, hey, I'm the provocateur, this is my job, and not really owning completely what they say. So I think that one consequence is we've embraced the snark, that has elevated the incivility, and I think it has dissuaded us from some of the facts.
Dylan?
I love snark, as anybody who's ever glanced at my Facebook page would be aware. I'm pretty damn snarky myself. The problem with too many people using something like The Daily Show or other political comedy, or so much of the satire you see spread around social media as how they become informed is it's cheap and easy. These guys are going for the easiest laugh that there is, and you miss the nuances. You certainly miss the ins and outs of some really important issues that should be discussed a little bit more thoughtfully, a little bit more rationally. And it's great to poke fun at our political leaders. I think it's necessary because I'm not very much of an authoritarian. I think we should strive to knock down people who try and put themselves above us, knock them down a peg a time or two. But we should also understand that that's not the be-all, end-all to knowing what's going on.
Chris, please, thanks.
Yeah, so, the other consequence of political comedy is, political, not economy, political comedy is the gateway aspect to it, where, among less informed, even, younger voters, it can prompt them to pay more attention to politics and be more engaged, and it becomes problematic if the comedy really leans too far to the right or to the left, but there can be, in some instances, beneficial consequences as well.
Thanks, Chris. Jill?
Just quickly, I totally agree with that. I'm working with a class of students at the U of A right now, and a lot of them really enjoy political comedy. And they don't see it as their source of news. They understand it as opinion and analysis, but a lot of them say that they'll go from something Stephen Colbert says, he'll mention like something that was in the New York Times, and off they go to the New York Times to read it. So I do think that it can be a positive gateway, assuming that kids understand, which in my experience they seem to, the difference between a news source and an opinion source.
Okay, and I'm also asked to announce that the League's radio show is starting this Sunday at 3:30 on KXCI 91.3 FM. The show covers all topics about voting and interviews with state and local candidates, or maybe more beyond local candidates. But you know, we could walk out of here this morning and believe that, okay, I'm a lot more informed than I was a few hours ago, and leave it at that. But let's not. Let's spread the message of this morning with friends, family, colleagues, neighbors, strangers, anyone who will listen. And I'll leave you with this quote from George Orwell's 1984. It has come to haunt us. The party told you to reject the evidence of your ears and eyes. It was their final, most essential command. So how are the ears and eyes you've got? And how is your power to discern the commands? It's good that we've come together. It's great that we've had this panel. So all I can say to everyone is thanks. Thanks for being here. Next month at the same place in October, on October 20th, we'll continue our journey as informed voters. Taking a look at Arizona ballot measures is our topic of inquiry. Be there, be informed. And to sum up this morning, vote. It is both a cherished right and an awesome responsibility. So everyone, be well, get home safe.